The morning of June 5th, 1960, began with a deceptive, crystal-clear stillness. For two young birdwatchers, Esko Johansson and his companion, the day was supposed to be a quiet excursion into the lush Finnish wilderness surrounding Lake Bodom. They moved through the dense undergrowth, their eyes scanning the canopy for rare sightings, their conversation hushed to avoid startling the wildlife. As they crested a small ridge overlooking a secluded peninsula, they expected to see the usual weekend campers. Instead, they saw a shape that felt instinctively wrong. From their vantage point, about 50 meters away, they saw a collapsed heap of blue canvas. It didn't look like a camp being packed up. It looked like a ruin. Esko stopped, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He noticed a blond youth, Nils, slumped over the top of the wreckage, his body twitching with a rhythmic, unconscious groan. The birdwatchers hesitated, gripped by a paralyzing sense of dread. They didn't hear shouting or pleas for help. They only heard the buzzing of insects in the growing heat and the heavy, oppressive silence of the pines. Overcome by a primal urge to get away from the wrongness of the scene, they didn't approach. They ran to find authorities. The image of that mangled blue tent burned into their minds. A visual of a sanctuary turned into a trap. To understand why that sight was so devastating, we have to look back less than 24 hours to the afternoon of June 4th. The four teenagers who arrived at that spot were the picture of youthful vibrance. Nils Gustafsson and Seppo Boisman were 18-year-old best friends, bonded by their love for their motorcycles and the burgeoning independence of early adulthood. Nils was the more reserved of the two, deeply protective of his girlfriend, 15-year-old Mila Björklund. Mila was bright, blonde, and possessed a radiant energy that seemed to anchor the group. Her best friend, Anja Maki, also 15, was her constant companion, a quiet, gentle girl who looked forward to this trip as a rare escape from the rigid expectations of suburban Helsinki. As they propped their motorcycles against the trees, the air was filled with the smell of warm pine needles and gasoline. They were exhausted from the ride, but exhilarated by the freedom. They set up their heavy, light blue canvas tent with practiced hands, staking it deep into the soft earth. The evening was a slow-motion dream of a Finnish summer. They ate light snacks, laughed about things that only teenagers find important, and Seppo and Niels spent hours by the water's edge, fishing as the sun hung perpetually low on the horizon. There was a profound sense of safety. They were young, they were together, and the forest felt like their own private kingdom. Around 11 p.m., as the white night settled into a pale, ethereal twilight, they crawled into the tent. They zipped the heavy flap shut, huddled together in their sleeping bags for warmth, and fell into the deep, trusting sleep of the innocent. But the forest was not empty. As the temperature dropped and the teenagers slept, someone or something approached the tent from the darkness of the trees. Between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., the massacre began. The attacker did not unzip the tent. He did not announce his presence. He launched a vertical assault on the structure itself, using a heavy blunt object, likely a large jagged stone, and a long knife. He began striking through the canvas from the outside. The first blows likely shattered the support poles, causing the heavy, wet fabric to collapse onto the sleeping teenagers, pinning them down. They were trapped in a dark, suffocating bag. The violence was visceral and chaotic. Seppo and Anja were struck through the cloth, the knife plunging blindly into the shifting shapes beneath the fabric. Mila Björklund, however, was the primary focus of a terrifying rage. The killer didn't just strike her. He tore at the canvas to reach her, inflicting injuries that were far more numerous and severe than those of her companions. She was bludgeoned with such force that her skull was shattered, and the knife wounds were frantic and deep. Niels, lying near the edge, was struck in the face with the blunt object, his jaw splintering and his consciousness fading into a red haze. The attack was swift, silent to the outside world, and utterly devastating. When the police finally arrived after the birdwatchers' report, they found a scene of forensic chaos. The investigation was doomed from the start. It was 1960. There were no yellow tapes, no specialized kits. Local residents and journalists were allowed to walk through the clearing, obliterating footprints and contaminating the blood-spattered soil. The lead detectives were baffled by the killer's trophies. Why had he taken their shoes? Why were the motorcycle keys gone, but their wallets and money left behind? For decades, the Lake Bodom murders became Finland's greatest ghost story. Theories sprouted like weeds. There was Carl Gillström, the kiosk man, who lived nearby and hated campers. He reportedly confessed on his deathbed, but the police had no physical proof. There was Hans Assmann, a mysterious German who showed up at a hospital the next morning, with blood-stained clothes and dirt-crusted fingernails, sparking rumors of KGB involvement. But without DNA, the case was a stalemate of shadows. The answer didn't come from a confession or a witness. It came from a laboratory in 2004. 44 years after the crime, the Finnish National Bureau of Investigation used Bloodstain Pattern Analysis, BPA, to look at a single overlooked item, Niels Gustafsson's leather shoes. In 1960, Niels claimed he was attacked inside the tent and lost consciousness, but the blood told a different story. The BP revealed that the shoes were covered in impact spatter, microscopic droplets of the victim's blood that only occur when a person is standing outside the tent striking down. Furthermore, there was a void on the shoes where Niels's own feet would have been, and no blood from the other victims was found inside his shoes. The scientific conclusion was shattering. The shoes were worn by the killer during the attack, and the shoes belonged to Niels. The theory shifted to a dark, psychological break. A teenage argument that escalated into a nightmarish frenzy, followed by a cold, calculated attempt to self-inflict wounds and hide the evidence. Though the court eventually acquitted Niels, due to the passage of time and lack of conclusive proof beyond a reasonable doubt, the blood on the shoes remains the only silent scientific witness to what truly happened on that shore. The 2004 investigation didn't just look at the blood. It looked at the geometry of the entire campsite through a modern lens. The forensic team conducted a reenactment of the void, a process where they recreated the exact folds of the collapsed tent to see if Niels's injuries were consistent with a random external attack. They found a chilling inconsistency. The slashes in the canvas were precise, designed to incapacitate the occupants while they were pinned under the weight of the fabric. Yet Niels's own injuries, while severe, lacked the lethal intent found on the bodies of Seppo and the two girls. His jaw was broken, yes, but the strikes were blunt and survivable, whereas Mila Björklund had been subjected to a sustained, frenzied overkill that suggested a deep personal vendetta. In the courtroom in 2004, the prosecution built a narrative of a psychological snap. They argued that a domestic dispute had erupted within the tent, perhaps fueled by teenage jealousy or a rejection. According to this theory, Niels had stepped outside the tent in a state of blind rage, put on his heavy leather shoes, and used a rock and a knife to eliminate the witnesses of his outburst. To cover his tracks, he allegedly hid the shoes half a kilometer away, returned to the site, and inflicted wounds upon himself to mimic the state of a victim before lying down on top of the ruins of the tent to wait for discovery. The defense, however, countered with a powerful argument: the passage of time. 44 years had contaminated the memory of the nation and the integrity of the physical evidence. They argued that the impact spatter on the shoes could have been caused by Niels being near the tent during the attack, or that the voids were simply the result of how the shoes were positioned on the ground. They pointed to the fact that no definitive murder weapon was ever found, and that the original 1960s investigation had been so poorly handled that any modern interpretation was built on a foundation of sand. The trial became a national obsession. For the Finnish public, Niels Gustafsson was no longer a victim to be pitied. He was a cipher. He sat in the courtroom, an elderly man with a weathered face, maintaining the same story he had told as an 18-year-old. I remember nothing. It was the ultimate stalemate between modern science and human memory. In October 2005, the District Court of Espoo delivered its verdict. Despite the sophisticated bloodstain analysis, the court ruled that the evidence was not beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense had successfully argued that a third party, a nameless, faceless man from the woods, could not be entirely ruled out. Niels Gustafsson was acquitted of all charges. The Finnish government was ordered to pay him one of the largest settlements in the country's history for the time he spent in custody and the damage to his reputation. The tragedy of Lake Bodom remains a perfect void in the Finnish psyche. We have the data. We know whose blood was on the shoes. We know the angle of the strikes. And we know the exact minute. The birdwatchers looked down upon that collapsed blue ruin. But science has its limits. It can reconstruct the physics of a strike, but it cannot reconstruct the dark impulses of the human heart in the middle of a white night. In 1960, whether the killer was a local man with a grudge, a mysterious stranger in a hospital, or the boy who lived to tell the tale, the result is the same. 3 lives were extinguished in a moment of incomprehensible cruelty, leaving behind only the sound of the wind in the pines and a dark lake that refuses to surrender its secrets. The Lake Bodom murders stand as a reminder that sometimes the truth doesn't just hide in the shadows of the forest. It hides in the gaps between what we can prove and what we choose to believe.